winemaker, Bruce Regalia. Good to see you, Bruce.
Good to see you too.
The barrel room, is that what you call it?
This is the North Barrel Room.
All right, well, why don't we take something out of the barrel, put it in our glasses while we talk about the wines here. This is called a wine thief, right?
It is.
I don't mean you, I mean the device.
No, both. So this is wine that we harvested 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
So this is Merlot from this vineyard.
2018 Materra Merlot.
So this wine is finished with primary fermentation, going through secondary fermentation. So it's part of the way through ML. It's interesting to taste young wines because you can kind of see where they're
through ML.
Yeah, malolactic
fermentation.
Malolactic fermentation,
right.
which is a secondary fermentation.
Right.
It softens wines. But you can get an idea of where it's headed.
You can. You really can. Now, before we talk about what it's like right now, how long will it remain in the barrel before it goes to the bottle?
Our Merlot spends between 18 and 20 months in barrel. Depends on the vintage. And we bottled the 16s this past summer. These will get bottled in 20.
Okay. And what type of oak are you using here?
We use all French oak. This is an interesting barrel. It's from Demptos Cooperage, and it's specifically made for Merlot. It does really well with our Merlot. And so what we do is every day we pick Merlot, we make it a separate lot, we give it a separate code, and we use different yeast and different coopers. And then throughout the year, we'll get them down and put them one high and score them all. This barrel always scores in the top 3 for our Merlot. So we've kind of narrowed down the selection of barrels for the Merlot program, the same with Chardonnay, same with all the varieties.
And for folks who are not serious wine enthusiasts yet, what characteristics will the oak impart, will the barrel impart to the wine?
It depends. There's a lot of, all the coopers have different toasting methods. They all have different sources of wood. Different force selections. And so what you try to do is pick out a barrel that complements your wine. So there's barrels that we have in here that build mid-palate, like make the center of the wine fatter. There's some that are more structure barrels. There's some that are aromatic barrels. And so what we try to do is build layers in the wine. And so we'll pick out a selection of barrels. Every lot of wine has maybe 5 or 6 coopers in it. And if you think of it,
coopers are
the barrel makers, the barrel makers.
Right.
And so you think about it as a spice rack. And so you can put layers and layers and layers on top. And for me, the most interesting wines are the ones that take you a while to figure out and have many layers and change in the glass throughout, the evening as well.
That's a great analogy, like a spice rack, yeah. Now, you know what? This wine tastes really good already. And I didn't know, it's nowhere near, 20 months?
Yeah.
Nowhere near ready for the bottle, but it tastes good out of the barrel already, which is not always the case.
No, it isn't. 2018 is, I'm going to go on record as saying it's going to be a phenomenal vintage. I mean, the quality this year was good. We had long, cool summer, and so real even growing. And back in the spring when the vines were flowering, everything's set like in a 4-day period. A lot of times we have a protracted bloom, and so you have small berries and big berries. And so when you go through the vineyard, you see unevenness of ripening. And so we'll go through and green thin at about 90% color. We'll drop everything that's too green. This year we hardly had to do that. We went through and broke up clusters, very uniform year. And the chemistry, high acids, really nice acids, things we like to see. Nice low pHs, and
what do you mean by low pH, just for the uninitiated?
A measure of acidity, just basically. Yeah.
Right.
And I think 2018s are going to age. I mean, they're going to be long-lived wines, so
That's
excited
fantastic.
about it.
And many times, Merlot doesn't necessarily have the ageability of a Cabernet. But
well, I'll tell you one thing about this ranch and Oak Knoll in general. I think of all the appellations in Napa Valley, Oak Knoll and Carneros are the best for Merlot because it is cooler. The wines retain acidity, and so they are longer lived, say, than something from up the Calistoga end of the valley. Not that you can't make good wine up there, but as far as ageability, Oak Knoll is a sweet spot.
So I know the coolness, the climate, the weather patterns contribute to the quality of the Merlot. What about the soil? What is it about the soil here in this appellation that allows you to produce a great Merlot?
Well, the soil on this ranch in particular are all alluvial. So the Napa River is one border of this ranch, and so this is the floodplain, millions of years of deposits of gravel and sediment here, and The Merlot here expresses red fruit. I mean, it's the raspberry kind of red fruit side of Merlot, which I love.
Right, right. Now, what about the other varietals? You grow Cabernet Sauvignon here as well.
Not on this ranch.
Not on this ranch.
Not on this ranch, but we do have a piece in Oak Knoll that's further, closer to the mountains, which is actually a warmer site. It's probably 10 degrees warmer there on any given day. So we'll be here with a sweater on, we'll go over there and you got to take your sweater off. And so it ripens nicely over there. But on this ranch we have Viognier, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, several clones of Chardonnay, Petit Verdot, Malbec, Merlot, and then a little block of Syrah.
Yeah. Apart from Syrah, you've got all the Bordeaux varietals, and then you got some Syrah in there as well. Did the wildfires last year have any impact on your Merlot here?
They did. Not on the Merlot. So we had picked the Merlot prior to the fires. We picked one lot of Cabernet 2 days before the fire. The wines that got affected from this ranch were Malbec and Petit Verdot. And we had everything else picked by then. So, we were lucky in that way, but I tasted a lot of smoke-affected wines. And we don't like to use the word taint.
Yep,
we call them smoke-affected.
Smoke-affected, yes, I understand.
And it was a huge industry-wide problem. And it's one of those things. We learned a lot from people in Australia because they had wildfires and they did a lot of the early research, but people are still learning. And the analytical lab in St. Helena that we use, ETS, I mean, they have some really great scientists working on the problem and when they think that the compounds are released and what the markers are and what it means down the road. But it's such a moving target as far as when the grapes are exposed to smoke, how long they're exposed for. It's just, there's so many variables that you almost can't predict.
Sure.
And so what people did this year, there was, wildfires in Lake County, Mendocino County. What people started doing is doing micro fermentations. And so they would take fruit from that vineyard, analyze it for those compounds, ferment it, and then analyze it again. And you kind of have a better idea of where it's going to head before you start making wine. So you can, be proactive in fermentation, get it off the skins quick, do different things winemaking wise that'll kind of mitigate that somewhat.
Now, speaking of getting an idea of where things are headed with a wine, how often do you taste a wine like this out of the barrel to get a sense of where it's going, how it's developing, and when it might be ready for the bottle?
When I walk by it. But, when I think about it, because, there are, so we have, I'm lucky because the guys in the lab, our assistant winemaker, Adam, and Alex, who's the enologist, have phenomenal palates, so they're fun to taste with. So there's a few times where we always taste, and so at the end of malolactic ferment, we're tasting the fermenters the whole time when they're fermenting, every day, we're tasting those. Once we go to barrel and they finish malolactic fermentation, we get them down one high. And we take a piece of chalk and we score them either -, 0, plus, or plus. Plus gets elevated to, like you tasted the Cunat Reserve. That's how we cherry pick those barrels out of the lot. That becomes its own lot. And then, we do that in the spring.
In the spring, okay.
Yeah.
So what characteristics are you looking for as you rate it, the plus?
Well, we're still trying to figure that, it's funny because we don't have history like vineyards in Europe, and so a big part of it is trying to learn about your vineyard and then figure out what coopers work with it, what yeast, what fermentation techniques work. And so we're always trying different things. And, I look for structure, I look for acidity. I want to see something that I think of wines as you're tasting through them so I'd look for the skeleton, and then I'd look for things to flesh it out. And so, we kind of build the wine, that's going to be the backbone. After 12 months, because you're tasting all the time, you're going, yeah, that. This adds fruit component, this adds structure, this adds tannin. And so if you put them together like that, it's an educated guess, because then we do a bench trial, and sometimes it doesn't work. And then we'll try to pull other things in. Maybe a little bit of Malbec helps it out, maybe a little bit of Cab Franc. And so that's the way we kind of build the wines.
And each year, each vintage produces different challenges, I guess, right?
Yeah, for sure. So that's your job, is to pull out your bag of tricks, and there's always something. And we're lucky because we have a great network of winemakers that are willing to exchange information. And so whenever I have a problem, I call my buddies. I just go, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, and invariably somebody will say, oh yeah, I ran into that, and 1995, and this is what I did, and it didn't work. You know?
Give me an example of what's in a winemaker's bag of tricks. Like what might be the character of a wine that would tell you, I need to employ this technique or that
Well,
technique?
I'll use something simple like fining.
Okay.
So when we first made our Diamond Mountain wines, I had no idea how to work with that fruit. I over-extracted it and it was tannic. I mean, it was too tannic. And so, one of the tricks is to use egg whites. When you put egg whites in, it'll attach to those tannins and settle them out in the barrel and soften the wine. And so you do a bench trial. Is it going to take 1 egg white per barrel, 2? And you figure it out. And there's a lot of enological products that you can do to do the same thing,
Right.
And, white wines use isinglass. Isinglass is the air bladder out of a sturgeon. That finds out certain things. And so there's a lot of, fermentation techniques, how hot you ferment, how you do your pump overs, extraction. So it's, the extraction for red wine for me is like making tea. And so the way that you do pump overs and bathe the cap and how much extraction you do at certain parts of the fermentation are really important to me. So I like to taste my pump overs and, at the beginning of a pump, a fermentation, you are extracting things in water. There's no alcohol yet, so the solvent is water. And so that's why people do cold soaks up front. Towards the end, when you get about halfway through, you have 10% alcohol. If you treat those wines too roughly, it extracts things from the seeds and tannins that we don't like, things that are astringent, things that are, bitter. And so you have to taste your tanks every day, and you have to switch up your pump overs, and so those are just tricks you learn.
It's just so much goes into this. I'm not unfamiliar with what you're telling me, but when I'm sitting, at dinner enjoying my wine, I don't think about all these things, and yet geeks like you.
Yeah. Well, it's a curse.
Yeah.
It's a curse because you know what? I'm a production person, and so like when I'm drinking wine, I'm like going, oh. It tastes like they pumped it over too much or whatever. And so unfortunately you start trying to analyze the wine and you start looking at the bad things first instead of just like, oh man, this is a great bottle of wine, And I find that when I go to Europe, my daughter was in Europe and she's on a student budget. And she's like going, I only spend €3 on a bottle of wine. And so I'm going, okay, let's up it to 5 and see what happens.
Yeah.
So we spent 2 weeks in Spain. We never paid more than €5 for a bottle of wine. We only got 1 bad bottle of wine.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, right?
How did you get into wine? Did you start at an early age? I know you took somebody's bottle and uncorked it. Right?
I worked for this gentleman that had a big ranch, and I was growing grapes for him, and I sold them to this one client, and he hired me to plant a vineyard. He asked me to plant a vineyard for him. And so I did, and he had hired this winemaker like late in the summer, like July or something, for that vintage. And it was in the middle of nowhere, it was in Anderson Valley. And so every day I'd go check on the vineyard, and this guy Paul would say to me, man, I don't know if I'm gonna make it through harvest with this guy. He's a good guy, but our chemistry, there's something not good about it. Yeah. And he didn't like to get wet. And every time the guy would throw the hose down with the trigger on it, it'd always land on the handle and like get him in the back of the head or something. And so like every day he would complain about it, And so one day I went there and he said, I fired him. And so I was like, well, what are you gonna do? And he said, why don't you do it? And so I've been making wine and brewing at home and whatnot. And I said, I don't know how to, I'm not trained. And he said, he talked me into doing it.
Wow.
And so that's how I became a winemaker.
OJT, on the job.
Yeah, it was. And I was really nervous about it too, but I fortunately had a lot of friends that were winemakers, and so before I did anything, I made phone calls.
Sure.
Tom Lane, great mentor. So I knew some solid winemakers, and so John Montero, Mike Richmond, and I would just call them up and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, and they'd either say, you're an idiot, or yeah, that'll probably work, so that's how I did. I just made sure,
So am I right in guessing that Merlot is your favorite varietal, or do you love them all?
I love, I really like to make Merlot. I think it's a phenomenal wine. I think it's much maligned, if you will.
I agree.
But I love Pinot Noir. I love to drink. I like to drink wines that change in the glass, and Merlot for me is one of those, and I think it's, really interesting to drink, and there's so many, there's a lot of Merlot. There's not a lot of great Merlot in California. True. And so for me, there are some great producers, and that's what I look for. I follow the producers,
Well, Merlot is interesting to drink, but when you meet a guy like Bruce, it's even more interesting to talk about. So thank you, Bruce. This is
Thank
cool.
you.
All right.